I am thrilled to be here, and in thinking about what to do, I was wondering whether I should give a talk on self-control, which I study, but nobody ever asked me to come talk to them about, or grit, which sounds better. So and I was thinking, like, well, how could I possibly in 55 minutes, because we really wanted to reserve the last half hour for just whatever questions are on your mind. How in 55 minutes could I possibly communicate everything I know about grit, self-control, why they're important, how they develop over the lifespan, and what to do to build them? So I decided to do it anyway. And in part is because I have, I don't know when the next time is that I'm going to be in Houston to talk to you about what we're doing, what we know, what we don't know. So I'm just going to say I've been accused of speaking quickly, and I'm going to do it tonight. I have a slide on almost everything that I've researched in self-control and grit. I might need to skip a few, so I'll just apologize in advance for the points that I don't cover as well as I should, and then encourage you to ask me more in the Q&A. But let's get started with grit. And on your seats, or as you were coming in, really, you have this questionnaire. It's not a lot of time to take the questionnaire, but there is enough time for you just to read the sentences on this page, right? So the idea of grit is not just perseverance, and that half of the items on this questionnaire that we typically use in research studies are about perseverance, dogged tenacity, never giving up. I finish whatever I begin. I am diligent, I never give up. I have achieved a goal that took years of work. That's half of grit, that's perseverance. But the other half of grit, I think, is just as important and maybe less obvious, at least to the kids at Wharton, whom I occasionally get to lecture to. And that is the idea of having consistent interests over time. Working not only really hard, but working toward the same goals, day after day, week after week, really year after year. And I think some of the kids who would run up to the podium after a talk at Wharton and want to tell me about how they didn't sleep for 3 days when they were fundraising for a new startup idea, and aren't I so gritty, Dr. Duckworth? I would say, well, you're great, love it, it's terrific, but the hard work part and the perseverance and the obstacles that you overcame is great, but if you're working toward the same high-level goal, the same abstract goal over years and years, I really want to become, the person who introduces biotechnology to this country. That's grit too. So it's important to have perseverance, but it's also important to have sustained passions, deepening and consistent interest over time. And that's why you can see that half of the sentences on the page there in front of you really have to do with that aspect of grit. Okay, so that's what grit is, and let's very quickly listen to Will Smith.
The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill. Right? I will run.
You would not be outworked.
I will not be outworked.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might be sexier than me. You might be all of those things. You got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, right, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple. Right.
I love Will Smith so much. I'm like married to the white Will Smith. So anyway, I just play this. I never get sick of it. But I think this idea that Will Smith is pointing to, which is that the capacity to work really hard for a really long time towards these consistent goals or interests, this is not the same exact thing as talent, right? So the kids who are lucky enough to be extremely talented at something, maybe they do or maybe they don't have this other capacity. And just to go back to what I think is actually the very first scientific investigation of achievement, we have to go all the way back to 1869. And Francis Galton, studying the biographies of very eminent individuals across mathematics and music and law and sports, said, in summary, that the truly eminent individuals in any society have not only talent, but talent in combination with zeal and the capacity for hard labor. I would argue, translating this into 21st century English, passion and perseverance, the 2 elements of grit. And in reading what Galton wrote down about what makes for success, high success in life, his somewhat more famous half-cousin, Charles Darwin, said in his letter back, "I have always maintained, in fact, that individuals did not differ much in their intellectual talent, but only in their zeal and hard work." Interestingly, elsewhere, Darwin describes his own feats in science to be not attributed to effortless epiphanies that came to him but didn't come to other people, but actually the fact that he really studied a small number of questions concerning nature and human nature for his entire life, and actually was thereby, through zeal and hard work, able to make progress on them. And I think it's a good way of actually organizing this very complex terrain to say, look, there are at least two things that are important to achievement in life. This is true for a fourth grader, this is true for a West Point cadet, this is true for a CEO. And that is that there is talent and there is effort. And together they multiply, if you will, to make for achievement. So many of us will remember in high school physics learning that distance equals rate times time. I think it's not unlike this equation. To achieve something, to go some distance, to get somewhere, it matters how fast you go, how quickly you learn, how easy things are, but it also matters a lot how long you're going for. And my lab studies in particular effort. It's not that we don't think talent exists, that we think, oh, we're all equally talented. I wish we were all equally talented. We're not all equally talented. But I think that in contemporary American culture, there's such an emphasis on talent, on SAT scores, on your IQ, on whether you're in the gifted and talented program or you're not in the gifted and talented program, whether you qualify or you don't qualify for the challenge program at your school. We have such an inordinate focus on talent that for that reason, as a former teacher myself, I wanted to study the mechanics of effort. And there, to me, seems like a lot more slack in the system when it came to effort than there was to talent. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. So, what do we know about how kids get better at things? Well, to actually give you probably the best sense of what we know about getting better at anything, let me summarize the research of Anders Ericsson. Anders Ericsson is a psychologist at Florida State University, originally from Sweden, and he is the world expert on world experts. So what Anders does is he studies World Cup soccer players, Sudoku champions, Olympic athletes, virtuoso musicians. In some of his studies, the kind of kids who go to Juilliard are in the control group for what he's really interested in, which is world-class eminent performance. So this is a little bit like Francis Galton's work in 1869, but now with the scientific method applied to it. And what he does is when he studies these individuals, he looks in particular at how they've acquired these world-class skills over time. And this graph from his own work summarizes what he's found. So when we hear this expression that there's a learning curve, there really is a learning curve, and this is a stylized version of it. We all start roughly at zero, not really knowing any complex human skill. We're not like horses who are kind of born knowing how to run. Human beings, as every parent in the room knows, are born knowing almost nothing, and we kind of crawl up the skill curve. But the thing is that really important about Anders' work is that it's not just sort of years of experience that get us to crawl up the curve. It's something that he calls deliberate practice. And when I describe to you the features of deliberate practice, it will become obvious to you why we're not all now at world-class levels at everything that we do. So deliberate practice has the following features, and they distinguish this from like everyday practice or just mere experience. The first thing is when you're doing deliberate practice, and whatever it is that you do for a living, whatever a student is doing in the classroom, they actually have to have a very specific self-conscious aspect of their performance in mind while they're practicing. Not, oh yeah, I'm here in math class and I'm doing math. But, you know, what I've been having a problem with is long multiplication. I'm just going to work on that because that's the aspect of my math performance that I really want to work on today. So a specific, not a general goal in mind. The second thing is that goal is typically about a weakness, not about a strength. So when experts practice things, I just watched, because really I only think about achievement all the time. So when I was on Netflix, I saw that there was this biography, sort of video biography of Usain Bolt, fastest man in the world still. And he has a weakness. You might not think that he does, but he does, and that's his start. So the very first few milliseconds of the 100-meter dash, he actually is slower than many of the other runners on the field. And given that that is his weakness, that is what Usain Bolt spends most of his training regimen working on. not the thing that he's already good at, which is the middle to the end of the race. I mean, he works on that too, but disproportionately he's working on weaknesses. So drilling your weaknesses, not doing the more comfortable thing, which is relying on your strengths. That's a second aspect of deliberate practice. Third, when experts practice, they proactively seek out feedback from their coach, from times, from like listening to what the music notes sound like. But immediate and informative feedback is crucial for learning, not only for human beings, by the way, but if you ever tried to train a dog and you never actually rewarded it for doing the behavior that was good, then you wouldn't get anywhere. I think a lot of K through 12 learning actually has that ridiculous feature, which is that kids do stuff, and then maybe 4 weeks later they get feedback on it, maybe. Now, in good schools, I think it's a lot shorter than that, but I even think in the best schools we can do more to actually close the feedback loop. And in the Q&A we can talk about how that might be possible with technology that was never possible before. But the third essential feature, just to reiterate, is that there is this immediate constructive feedback that happens and that the learner, that the person who's actually getting better at the skill actually proactively seeks out. Then fourth and finally, deliberate practice is done over and over and over and over and over and over again until mastery. So experts do not move on from one skill to the next when they're kind of sort of got the first thing, now I'll do the next thing. They only move on when they can do things with such fluency, with such automaticity that actually it doesn't require a lot of cognitive effort anymore. And so they work to perfection before moving on to another aspect of their performance. As a former math teacher, there were plenty of kids in my class who got B pluses or worse that I merrily moved on to the next topic. But in doing so, I was failing to meet one of the requirements of deliberate practice, which is to make sure that what I had taught them was so solidly under their belt that they could move on with full focus to the next skill. So it's a challenge, I think, actually, to think about the way our kids are learning in the classroom and some of the structural features of what they need to do and how to manage in this big group setting. But I think there are crucial lessons here from Olympic athletes and other world-class experts about what optimal learning really looks like. Having learned about deliberate practice myself, I was left quite puzzled. I sort of knew why I wasn't a world-class runner because I realized that though I had run for thousands of hours in my life, I had never once actually tried to do something which was a specific goal about my running, where I was training a weakness, not a strength, with feedback, and then doing it over and over again. So that was clear, right? But I also kind of wondered why, at least in the things that we do for a living, we're not all world-class. Right? And when I talked to Anders Ericsson, he said, well, the thing about deliberate practice is that with rare exceptions, people hate it. And I said, well, Olympic athletes probably don't hate doing practice. He's like, oh no, they hate it too, right? So they don't hate every aspect of their sport, obviously, but when they have to do the very effortful, focused, deliberate practice on their weaknesses that really makes them better at what they do, it's actually not fun. And in fact, in study after study, it turns out that people can only sustain, even at international levels of performance, 3, maybe 4 hours of deliberate practice on average per day, even when you have the most motivated individuals. So it is exhausting, frustrating, sometimes tedious and boring deliberate practice, and that got me thinking about, what would enable people to do more of this very good for you in the long run, really not so fun in the short run kind of thing, again and again and again over the decades that real world-class people actually operate. And that links to my program on grit. So coming back to perseverance and passion, the bottom line is that we're finding that people who are able to sustain their interests and to sustain effort over years, these are the people who do more deliberate practice, and that is, we think, why they actually are more successful than others. Very quick tour, because we want to get to the more interesting question of how to build grit. At the National Spelling Bee, we gave kids the same questionnaires that you have in your hands. We asked them to fill it out several months before the finals. We also gave them an IQ test over the phone because these kids are all over the country. And it turns out that, just like the equation says, both effort, or grit, and talent independently predicted how far kids would get in the National Spelling Bee. And what I want to say about this study that I found over and over again in data set after data set is that the relationship between grit and talent is either 0 or in many cases slightly negative. It doesn't mean that every talented kid is low in grit, but what it does mean is that there's no guarantee that a child who's extremely gifted is necessarily going to be the one who works hard. And mathematically, it is a rare individual who really is an outlier in both talent and hard work. And I think if you think of the most successful people in your own fields, my guess is they're going to be extremely high in talent and extremely high in effort. And because those things aren't very related, they're very, very rare individuals indeed. The second year that we ran this study, we asked kids to keep a diary of what they did to improve their spelling. And there are essentially three things that you can do, or you're advised to do, to win a spelling bee. On the far left, we have deliberate practice, and kids actually had to rate these activities. They're much more specific than this, like writing words on a page, over and over again vertically. But we grouped them into these three classifications: deliberate practice, being tested by mom or dad or someone else, and then finally on the far right, reading and other verbal leisure activities. The kids wrote down how many hours they spent doing these activities, and they also rated them on a scale from 1 to 9 on enjoyability and effort. Here's what they said. Deliberate practice is, if you look at the dark gray bars, the least enjoyable kind of practice there is. And if you look at the light gray bars, the most effortful. The same thing that Olympic athletes and musicians tell us. Being tested by mom or dad is somewhere in the middle, and what they really want to do is read all day. So their ratings of the enjoyment and the effort of reading were comparable to, we had an item on the questionnaire, eating ice cream, which was a little disturbing to me, honestly, but they are kids in the National Spelling Bee, so they're unusual, and anyway, that's what they want to do, right? Now when you look at the data and you watch ESPN, you see who wins, you can say that the hours of deliberate practice that these kids were doing when controlling for the other kinds of practice was the only kind of practice that actually predicted their objective performance in the finals themselves. And of the many traits that we studied, grit was the strongest predictor of how many hours kids would do. So consistent with this idea that grit enables you, among other things, to do deliberate practice, and that seems to actually drive performance, is borne out in this data. I'll say something about this variable down here called openness to experience. That's the phrase that psychologists use for qualities like intellectual curiosity, imagination, learning just for its own sake, which in this case was negatively correlated with final performance and was not related to any of the kinds of practice that I told you about. Now, there's a bigger conversation to be had, and I hope we can have that in the Q&A about, well, what's curiosity good for? But I will say this, kids who are intellectually curious don't necessarily do the work that actually translates curiosity into productivity. And I think that might be the lesson here. Not that curiosity is necessarily a bad thing, but it's no guarantee of actually doing hard work. At West Point, we've been studying grit for over 10 years, and every year we go to West Point on day 2 of Beast Barracks. This is the first summer at West Point, transitioning you from being a mere civilian to a member of the military, right? So the U.S. Army gets 25% of its officers from West Point. The West Point higher-ups are very interested in keeping the young men and women at West Point once they're admitted, because they don't replace them. So for every cadet that drops out, it's sort of a loss of roughly $500,000 of taxpayer income and so forth. And what do we find? Well, every year we get a graph like this, which is that grit tends to predict how likely it is that you will make it through. Not only the first summer, which I have here on this graph, the first Beast Barracks summer, but also all 4 years of West Point. So you see grit there in quartiles, at the top in the 4th quartile, the gritty individuals, and then at the bottom, the 1st quartile, the less gritty. Now, at West Point, they measure something else, and this is called the whole candidate score. It's what I would call their rough approximation of talent. It has a lot of SAT score loaded in there. It has a physical talent measure based on push-ups and sit-ups and running. It has a measure of your leadership potential based on experts who review your application. It has some of your high school rank in there as well. What's fascinating to me is that this measure of talent actually is a terrific predictor of how well you'll do at West Point if you stay. But it does not predict whether you will stay. Woody Allen once, when interviewed for the New York Times, to say what advice does he give to young writers, this is many years ago, said, well, my first advice is to write the actual book. Because most young writers tell me that they're working on the book, they want to know how to write the book, but they never actually write the book. 80% of success in life, Woody Allen is quipping here, is just showing up. Right? And I think what we're seeing here is that talent is no guarantee of hard effort, but it's also just no guarantee that you're even going to show up to be in the game at all. We find the same pattern of showing up versus dropping out across other samples. On the left, I have sales representatives. The grit scores are higher for sales representatives who keep their jobs. There's about a 50% turnover rate in sales in the first year. The grittier sales representatives are more likely to keep their jobs than the sales representatives who drop out. The Chicago Public High School students, we surveyed thousands of kids in their junior year in the Chicago Public Schools. Kids who go on to graduate from high school are grittier than those who drop out. And then finally in the Special Forces, the most elite arm of the Army, which is an extremely high voluntary dropout rate of their extraordinarily difficult training, the Special Forces officers who make it through are grittier than those who drop out before completion. To give you an idea that this is not just coming out of my lab, this is just a study done by the Marketing Leadership Council. It's kind of a consortium of marketing teams from very large Fortune 500 companies. And they ran an interesting study where their hypothesis, I think, at the beginning was in the 21st century, things are changing all the time. And maybe what you need to be a successful marketer is someone who is agile and flexible and really kind of sort of interdisciplinary in their thinking. But what they found was that the focused, gritty marketers who persevere despite setbacks and who prefer depth over breadth were by far the most successful kind of marketer in their research study, both on qualitative measures like supervisors' descriptions and on quantitative measures. Now, I want to say something about assessing grit without this kind of fakeable, ridiculous questionnaire that you have in your hands, because for obvious reasons, you can't tell Harvard that they should be admitting students based on, whether the student reports themselves that they are a diligent, hard worker with consistent interests. And I want to say in particular in the context of kids and education, because what I'm really talking about here is looking at grit through the lens of their activities outside of their formal classes. So what you have before you here is a rubric that we've developed. We actually modified a rubric that was developed in 1985 by ETS, your friendly neighborhood SAT prep, or SAT company. In 1985, they did a study called Success in College, and what they found that over 100 variables that were measured in this study, the best predictor of success in college after SAT score and high school rank was something they called follow-through. And they quantified it much like I have here, which is to say that if a kid has demonstrated multi-year commitments to certain extracurricular activities and progression, advancement with objective evidence thereof in those activities, it doesn't matter if it's sports or music, student government, or even a paid job, the more they've demonstrated multi-year commitments and follow-through and advancement, the more likely they are to go on to be successful in college. We use the same approach to actually quantify grit from looking either at kids' high school, on the Common App, there's actually a section for this, or actually resumes of young adults. And here, a study of new teachers, we found that if you quantify grit in this way from their resumes, you can predict all the same outcomes that you can with questionnaires. So, for example, teachers who persist through the end of the school year instead of dropping out are more gritty based on their resumes. And also, once the teachers have shown up and decided to stay the whole year, we can quantify their effectiveness based on the academic gains of their own students. And teachers who are grittier based on their resumes have kids who learn more in their classroom. And the fascinating thing here is that it's not just grit in teaching, it's grit in anything. Right? I have a strong bias towards hiring former athletes in my class because demonstrated grit over 4 years on a team with a coach who's yelling at you, going to practice again and again and again, learning to lose some matches, come back again, and showing me that you've progressed through that shows me that you have the elements that you need also to work for me in this gritty way. And this is what we're seeing in this study. It didn't really matter where the grit came from or was demonstrated. And I think the lesson for educators is, if that's true, if this is a way that kids can exhibit grit, is it also a way for them to develop it? Is the place to develop grit not just in the academic work, but also in all the other things that we hope kids are doing outside the classroom? Now, in a study that I just completed and is in press, we wanted to look at some of the underlying motivations of gritty people. And I'll say something just very quickly about this. There was a questionnaire that was developed that says, look, there are at least 3 different approaches to becoming a happy person in life. One is pleasure, right? So some people are really oriented to, ending life with the most toys, eating the most sushi, having the most back rubs. Then there's another route to happiness, which is more Aristotelian, and that is to be really engaged and absorbed in what you're doing. And then finally, maybe the most Aristotelian of all is, the desire to achieve happiness through meaning and purpose, through service to others, being part of something, and in service to something greater than yourself. Essentially, a short description of your typical yes prep or KIPP teacher. I looked at this data, and before I actually took this data where we assessed grit and we actually administered this questionnaire, my hypothesis was that gritty people are really driven by meaning and purpose. They get up in the morning again and again to do what they do because it's so meaningful to society and to people other than themselves. Well, that hypothesis was somewhat confirmed because the grittier you are, the higher you are in desire for meaning and purpose. However, the strongest predictor of being gritty was just being, someone who wants to be engaged and absorbed in what they do, even if it's chess and it doesn't help anyone. But just someone who just likes to be lost in what they're doing with complete concentration, which actually, by the way, sounds a lot to me like deliberate practice, so maybe it's no coincidence. And finally here, people who really like to be there in the moment and enjoy life just for its kind of hedonic pleasures are actually less likely that it's negatively correlated with grit. Now, I'm not sure what to do about that from an intervention point of view because I don't know how to change what deeply motivates people. So let me just move on quickly to some ideas about building grit that I think are more tractable. The first thing I'll say as a preface to my other comments is that it's not that I'm up here asking that every kid do just the hardest thing that they could possibly do all the time. Right? On the contrary, I think kids need to be taught that the first thing to do is to choose things that feel easy to them, that they could just, do all day long if nobody made them do, right? Things that they're naturally inclined to do. Interests, you might be interested to know, are more stable over the life course than even your personality. So if you think back to what you kind of were spontaneously interested in when you were 12 or 13 years old, my guess is that you still have those interests today. Right? And I think it's important that kids actually plumb their own interests. It's not just important that they do well in our reading and our math tests, but they develop things that they really, really can sustain as passions for the rest of their life. Having done that, it's time to do deliberate practice, right? So it's a phase 1, choose easy, phase 2, work really, really hard kind of idea. Now, the first thing I'll say about possibly of use to building grit is that at West Point 2 years ago, we ran an extra study. After doing all these questionnaires, and grit was not the only one, it was just the most predictive one of whether they would stay at West Point, we asked them to do a counterfactual exercise. We asked them quite simply, well, today's day 2 at West Point, where would you be if you could be anywhere, but if you weren't here? What would be the best thing that you could think of, right? And the cadets filled in this little box, and they wrote things like, I would be the quarterback at ASU, or I'd be at Yale studying history, or I'd be helping on my dad's farm, all very interesting. And then they had to categorize these into one of 4 categories. So we have grit here on the y-axis, and then the category into which their response fell of their own imagined other future or other place that they could be. Now, on the far left, you have downward comparisons. These are most of cadets, about 75% of cadets. Named something, but then when asked to rate this other scenario, said it's decidedly worse than being at West Point, which makes sense since they just showed up, right? Now, the second category is my favorite. About 7 or 8% of cadets simply could not imagine anywhere else. They're like, oh, I don't know, I'm here. This is where I actually think that group, which is just as gritty as the first group, might in the long run end up being the grittiest group of all. The third group here said, and this is again 7 or 8% of cadets, it's about the same as being here at West Point. And then finally, about the same number of cadets said, honestly, this imagined scenario is better than being here. When we ran the stats, we found that this idea of thinking about where you are, not where you're not, so the first 2 groups of either thinking about something worse or not being able to imagine anything else at all, this style of counterfactualization is what explains perhaps why gritty people do things like show up, right? Gritty people show up in part, we think, because they're focused on what they are doing, not on all the opportunity costs, not on all the things that they might have been doing if they weren't here. Now, the second thing that we think is quite relevant and very tractable for developing grit is really not my idea at all, but the work of my heroine, Carol Dweck at Stanford. You'll not meet a more accomplished psychologist, and you'll certainly not meet a kinder one. And what Carol Dweck has taught us over the last 30 or so years of her work is that people walk around in the world with beliefs, theories about how things work. And one of the theories in particular is whether you think human nature is malleable and grows and changes over time, or whether you're inclined to believe that, people don't really change. You really can't, change fundamentally, how quickly a child can learn. And she's found that growth mindset about intelligence in particular predicts perseverance over adversity. And we quite sensibly find in our recent work together that gritty individuals are more likely to have a growth versus a fixed mindset. And this is good news because Carol has figured out how to change fixed mindset. And that is to show kids scientific evidence that, in fact, people do change, which they do, and to show them pictures of neurons making new connections and even growing well into adulthood. So that's, I think, a very promising idea, and I think our best schools, including our KIPP schools and our YES schools, have fully embraced this. Kids actually know what a growth mindset is in these schools, and they know that people change over the life course. They know what William James did not know. William James once said, William James, when he was a professor of psychology at Harvard, said that, at a certain age, human nature is set like plaster, never to change again. And a lot of us sort of think about things that way. But if we do, then we're wrong. And so was William James, because it's not true of human nature. Personality, for example, evolves and changes all throughout adulthood into your 60s and beyond. In particular, I want to emphasize here something about teachers, because I think that one of the clear cultural elements that really draws me to schools like YES and KIPP is this idea that teachers not only need to teach character to their kids, but they need to embody it. Right? So not just do as I say, not as I do, but do as I do also. And in this study, we study something closely related to growth mindset, and that is optimism. Optimism comes out of the clinical research on depression, with the finding that optimistic individuals are the ones who focus on things that can change in their lives, and pessimistic individuals, who are more likely to become depressed, focus and catastrophize about things that they can't change. So something happens and you don't know really why, like, you didn't get a good grade on a test and you're a little surprised. An optimistic child will say, I think the reason why is I didn't study the right things and I didn't study in advance far enough. A pessimistic, catastrophizing child will be like, I'm a total idiot. I screw up everything, right? And if you have an optimistic mindset, quite sensibly, you'll go and try to work harder the next time. But if you're a pessimist, you sort of give up, because why would you work? And in this study, we find that optimistic teachers are more likely to be gritty, and this part I love, they're also more likely to be happy with their own lives, not actually about their work life, but just overall satisfaction with their own life. And both grit and happiness predict teaching performance 1 year later, as measured by the academic gains of their kids. So whatever emphasis we're placing on teaching character to kids, I think we have to place equal emphasis to making sure that teachers have the relevant resources as well to grow their own characters. Now I'm going to show you this little video and I'll explain it right after that.
I wonder what I should study first when I get home. Step 1. Work on your weaknesses. I know, I will work on math since it's my weakest subject. Ag, there are too many distractions here. I can't concentrate. Step 2. Concentrate 100%. No one will bother me here. I'm finished with all the practice problems, but I wonder how well I did. Step 3. Get feedback. I got all the addition and subtraction problems correct, but all the multiplication problems wrong. It seems like I really need to practice my multiplication. Not perfect, but I'm getting better. And remember to repeat, repeat, repeat.
So this is a clip from an online intervention that we're developing for middle school students, where essentially I'm giving this lecture, but a little more jazzed up than just PowerPoint slides. And there are some other tricks that we put in there too, like if you really want to get someone to internalize a message, you have them try to convince someone else. So at the end, they write a letter to another student summarizing what they've learned and how it could be applied in their own lives, that sort of thing. And very much actually, by the way, inspired by Carol Dweck's own intervention research on mindset. And this is the idea that, well, in addition to optimism and mindset and focusing on what you are doing versus what you're not doing, maybe just telling kids, athletes, musicians, and world-class individuals of any other kind do this kind of practice, and this is what it looks like, and this is how it would translate to you doing your homework tonight, something that you might not see a natural bridge to yourself. We're running random assignment, placebo-controlled trials of this now, and if I come back in a year, I'll tell you whether it worked, and in the meanwhile, we're sharing this freely and openly with all of our, I guess, cousins, right? I don't know if I'm I'm probably in the extended family. I'm like a second cousin to KIPP and to Yes, and the teachers can do whatever they want with it. They can show them, they can not show them, they can tweak them if they like. Now, before I end with ideas on grit, I want to say something about the social context, because I used to think grit was just about the individual, the cowboy or the cowgirl who just did it and everything was on their own. But I think what we're learning is that when people persevere through things, it's not only because of their own grit, it's also because of people that they rely on to be gritty when they can't be. So I'll just read you this quick anecdote from someone who was interviewed in a study at University of Chicago, which was called the Developing Talent in Young People Study. And these are individuals who were interviewed in their 40s about their childhoods. This is an Olympic swimmer who reflects back and says, when I was 11, I wanted to bag it because I was doing very badly. My dad at that point did something that was very important. He said, if you want to quit, that's fine. But I don't want you to quit simply because you're losing. So I'm going to continue to drive you to workouts and force you to swim, and when you turn 12 and are at the top of your age group, you'll start to do well. If you want to quit then, that's fine. I can speak for myself as a parent that I have been in this situation many times. Like, is this the day to push the kid, or is this the day not to push the kid? And I don't have an easy answer for that, but I think, we are our kids' conciliaries in many ways. We are their partners who have something that they don't have because nobody has this for themselves, that we have psychological distance from them. When they come home and they've had a horrible day, we feel very bad for them, but it wasn't our day, right? And we need partners in life. I would argue that we need spouses in life, we need teachers in life, we need coaches in life, we need best friends in life. And very often, these are the people who are saying, this is such a terrible day, this is awful, but we don't quit on a bad day. If you're going to quit, quit on a good day, when you have all your reason and faculties about you. So that's one thing about, I think, grit. It's not just growth mindset and optimism and focusing on what you're doing. It's about the network that you develop, your cousins. And then finally, at the school level, I think there's the opportunity to build a culture of this, right? I just want to highlight here 3 simple ideas. One is that in Finland, there is a word that roughly translates to grit, not exactly. And the thing about Finland is that people talk out loud about their sisu. First of all, they think that it's a mark of Finnish character. They are skeptical that anyone outside of Finland has this. And then they say things like, oh, I did this really hard cross-country race. It was 5 days. It was bitterly cold. But you know what? I built my sisu. Young children talk about building their sisu. Talk about baking in growth mindset from the beginning. I think that is a sort of a trail of breadcrumbs that schools like Yes and why KIPP should follow, right? And I think actually they're doing a lot of this already, but I'll just emphasize it here. On the bottom there's a White House initiative, and this very gritty and also adorable Brown student has put up a website called This Is Grit, and he's just collecting 2-minute stories where people, you go to the website, it turns on your webcam, and you just tell your story about grit in your life. So that's getting off the ground, and I think it's a terrific initiative to change cultural attitudes, to demystify achievement, to tell kids, when kids do well in life, it's not like everything was easy for them. They struggled, they cried, they felt disappointed, they were embarrassed, they wanted to give up also, like you do too. And then finally, I want to encourage you to read this article from the New Yorker called Get a Coach by Atul Gawande, who talks about the surgery room culture and how what they need is a big dose of growth mindset, deliberate practice, the idea that failure, but learning and coaching and feedback are things that if you don't build it into the culture, they won't be there by default, and then people don't learn as much as they should. So I'm going to end my comments there. You can read a little bit about what Will Smith is saying about treadmills and so forth. He actually has an entire rap called The Treadmill. I don't think it hit the bestseller charts, but I like it a lot. And then I'm going to ask my friends to show the self-control slides. I'm going to zip through these actually much more quickly in the interest of time. And as a transition, let me say this. When Francis Galton in 1869 said the most eminent individuals have zeal and the capacity for hard work, right, who have passion and perseverance, he also said in the same breath that many of us are under the misimpression that high achievement in life comes from self-denial. And then he goes on to say, it is not the case that super achieving individuals, the most eminent individuals, have this kind of, self-denial or self-control against the hourly temptations, as he put it, though that is important for navigating everyday life. And I think that is the difference between grit and self-control. Grit is about staying committed to something in the very long run that's especially challenging. Self-control is about, in the moment, being able to fend off these hourly temptations and distractions. Essentially, to put it more succinctly, self-control, according to Frog and Toad, is trying hard not to do something that you really in the moment want to do because it feels really good. And here is the story Cookies, where they bake a bunch of cookies and have lots of failures of self-control, trying not to eat them, and actually learn something about self-control along the way. There's lots to be said about self-control. It's a hot topic. Stephen Colbert is talking about self-control. Barack Obama is talking about self-control. The marshmallow task in particular, where kids are asked to delay the gratification of getting 2 marshmallows by waiting and not eating one right away, has gotten so much press that my Vanguard newsletter is telling me about not eating marshmallows and being self-controlled. And just to give you a quick sense of what this looks like, in young children, these are the questionnaire items that are used to assess self-control. This is kids in preschool or in kindergarten, and you can see the continuity here. This is the questionnaire that's often used with school-age children, say late elementary school and maybe even middle school. And then finally, this is what self-control looks like in adults. This is the most widely used self-control scale for adults. So you can see that the evolution of self-control over the life course really has its roots in early childhood. And I study it because as a teacher, I believe, as Aristotle has been paraphrased to say, that in some ways the roots of education are bitter, and only the far off, many years later fruit is sweet. So if the roots are bitter, but the fruit is sweet, kids need self-control, because Angry Birds or Candy Crush is more fun than doing your homework. And to give you some data to back that up, there's a Sloan study, a study of over 1,000 kids in middle school and high school who wore wristwatches that beeped them randomly 56 times over the course of a week during waking hours. And every time it beeped, they filled out a long questionnaire about what they were doing, and on 26 different items, how it felt. Well, if you ever wonder what a day in the life of a kid looks like, this is it. They actually spend more of their waking hours doing something related to academics than any other activity. There's, kind of passive leisure and socializing, et cetera, et cetera. But the key feature of this data is the following. Across girls and boys, rich kids and poor kids, black kids, Latino kids, Asian kids, you name it, when asked how important is what you're doing right now to your future goals, in yellow we coded all the academic activities, in blue is everything else. Kids of all stripes say, oh yeah, what I'm doing right now is more important than anything else I do all day long. when asked, okay, are you happy right now doing those academic activities, it's typically below the mean. And on other questions like, is there anything else you'd rather be doing, it's even starker than that. So I think this sets up the sort of the story that Aristotle was right, that there is a certain bitterness to doing things now, even if the fruit is sweet later on. I'm going to skip a couple slides in the interest of time, but self-control predicts a lot of things, like doing well in school. And in a recent study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, self-control predicts everything else. Income, employment, physical health, not going to jail, relationship satisfaction, and on and on. I refer you to the article if you want to read about it. I've been doing work using data that includes Social Security earnings, and we find that self-control is the best personality predictor of whether you'll earn more in 25 years of Social Security earnings history, and actually also whether you'll participate in the workforce as opposed to being unemployed. And then finally, it is the best predictor also of savings or wealth, controlling for how much you earned relative to lots of other personality traits. I'm going to skip a few more slides and just say that when Walter Mischel was interviewed last year, now Walter is the architect of the marshmallow task itself, and now in his 80s, when he can say whatever he wants, Walter says the most important scientific discovery about self-control is that it can be taught. And he says this because when he observed children, this is actually slides from Walter's own work, these kids who are sitting there and struggling and trying to resist the first marshmallow so that they can actually wait long enough for the experimenter to come back in the room and give them two. He observed that kids employed strategies. Even at age 4, kids have tricks and strategies that they use to make self-control easier. And that, he says, is the secret to self-control. Not just, growing your willpower muscle, but learning the ways to make willpower easier versus harder. And to organize this for you, I'm going to give you 5 kinds of strategies that kids could use to exert self-control in the moment, even though there's something else that feels better. The first strategy, and I should say that I've done this work with my collaborators at Stanford, James Gross and Tamar Gemler, who is not only a philosophy professor, but a psychologist at Yale. So part of my secret plan is to get every awesome psychologist to be working with KIPP and YES and other schools. And I think this is a small victory here that we were able to do that. So the first class of self-control strategies is situation selection, simply choosing where to be. If you are an alcoholic, don't go to a bar. And if you are a kid sitting in lecture hall, don't sit in the back. Any undergraduate at Penn who works in my lab is required to promise that at all of their lectures they will sit in the front. And they ask me, Dr. Duckworth, why do I have to sit in the front? And I say, because this is what it looks like from the front of the classroom. It's a hell of a lot easier to pay attention to the professor when they're staring at you 6 feet away than when you're up here lost in the crowd, right? Likewise, choose your social situation carefully because it's going to have downstream effects on everything that you do. So the earliest strategy to use in self-control is situation, social or physical, selection. Having chosen where to be, you can still modify your place or change your, I have a 5th grade teacher who told me that situation modification is not the sexiest way to sell things to a 5th grader. So she said, why don't you call it choose your place, change your space. So now we're on change your space. How would you change your space? Well, for example, no matter where you sit in my lecture, you could close your laptop. I used to think they were all taking notes. I once took a bathroom break, and I'm like counting back down the aisle. It's just like this, and I'm like, eBay, Facebook, Gmail, nobody was taking notes. And I think, the idea of closing your laptop is something that I've taken to heart. I go to boring meetings too, just like you do. And if I have my laptop open and my wireless on, I will check my Gmail account. It's inevitable, but I can make physical modifications to my environment which make that actually hard or impossible to do. Relevant to kids, and we were having a little conversation about this at the very beginning before I actually got started here. Kids can do things. They can install apps that limit their time, but you know what? What's worked for my 10-year-old is just powering off the phone as opposed to putting it to sleep has dramatically decreased her playing games or texting. And I asked her why. I was like, well, the phone is still there. You can use it. She's like, oh, yeah, but, it takes forever for it to warm up. yeah, like 3 seconds. She's like, yeah, right, forever. And I was like, okay. So, these are the clever things. And wouldn't it be a fun thing, right, as opposed to an awful thing, for kids to play psychologist in their own lives and to say, like, okay, what tempts me? Like, what tricks can I play on myself? Right? How can I be clever here and outsmart myself in a way so that I actually do the thing that's going to make me happier in the longer run? There was a great study that was done at Cornell University by Brian Wansink recently. He placed candy on secretaries' desks and randomly assigned secretaries either to get the candy in a clear bowl or in a bowl that was painted so you couldn't actually see what was inside. Well, as you would predict, the secretaries ate dramatically less candy when it was in the bowl where they couldn't actually see it. Out of sight is out of mind. In Walter's early marshmallow studies, kids did the same thing. If they cover the marshmallow, they can wait 2 times, maybe even 3 times as long, because it's not as tempting when you can't see it, right? Hide the Halloween candy, we all know that, but what other distractions in your kids' lives could they hide by simply putting them where they can't obviously see it? I'll play this little clip if it's easy and short. Temptations have been around forever, but I would argue that they're getting worse. They're getting more potent. And algebra is never going to be as fun as Candy Crush. The one thing that kids, I think, can do to realize that they can actually change their physical situation. How can they make resisting temptation easier for themselves? So put the cell phone out of reach, or make the homework the first thing that you see when you walk into your bedroom.
Anita, what did you?
That's
You
what
actually
you did, right?
physically made changes, didn't you?
Yeah, in the school that I'm in now, we actually board at that university, and so we, the previous year, me and my roommate kept our beds kind of on the floor, so that we could chill out when we wanted to.
Yeah.
This year, we realized that the higher the bed, the higher the GPA. So we raised
really?
our
Why
bed.
is that?
I mean, I think that having your bed right there is a distraction in itself, just like
Plop
a cell
down
phone.
in it.
You can just plop down and it's comfortable. And so when you raise it high, then you have to get down in the morning to turn off your alarm. You have to get up into bed if you want to go to sleep. And so it actually keeps you at your desk. It keeps you working.
I love her, and she's now, we started a student, I met these kids, both her and the high school student next to her. I was like, so I'm going to start a student advisory board today, and are you going to be on it? And they're like, sure. So now we email our interventions to this panel of high school kids, and they tell us that they suck. And then we fix them. I'm not going to play a video of this, but, essentially we're using the same idea of like, okay, let's teach kids about research conducted at Cornell University. Give them the evidence. Don't just berate them and, exhort them to do things. Give them the kind of evidence that they'll find persuasive. And I actually think it's easier for me to do that than a parent to do that, because finding me on YouTube telling them something is way more convincing than you telling them over and over again. Even when my kids find something else on YouTube, it's more persuasive than when I tell them. I'm like, actually, I'm an expert in this. They're like, oh, yeah, but I found this on YouTube. And I was like, okay, great. So anyway, we do use kind of YouTube style and this kind of, light touch. And in a recent random assignment test of this with 190 undergraduates at Penn, when assigned to learn about situation modification versus the last kind of strategy, which I'll talk about before we wrap up, which is just response modulation, just don't do it, just use your willpower, or a no treatment control, students were able to accomplish their self-set academic goals more days out of 7 than in these other conditions. And the key here is that they didn't feel as bad doing it. So the feeling of temptation and resisting temptation, the distress of that, was actually markedly lower having removed temptations entirely. If I take my flight back tomorrow, actually it's the day after tomorrow, and I have Us Magazine with me, and I have a manuscript I'm supposed to review, it's going to be torture for 3.5 hours. But if I get on the flight and I don't have Us Weekly, and it's just the manuscript or the US Airways magazine, then I will be in a situation which just makes self-control a lot easier. And that's my intention, so you can hold me to it. Okay, so the third class of strategies is selective attention. So you chose your place, you changed your space. Now, where do you pay attention? I think that this is the reason why KIPP emphasizes tracking and slanting. And it's because, paying attention's hard, but it's really hard to understand what the teacher is saying if you're looking out the window. If you actually physically have your orientation toward that teacher and your eyeballs on the teacher, it makes it all that much easier. And there are other examples of selective attention. I'll play just a little bit of this.
this now? Before we go on? That's great, thank you. Look. Hey, man.
Sorry, me interrupting anything. Me just
No, actually, we're on a break right
really
now.
me happen to smell something.
Yes, I've just made the correlation between your name and what I'm about to eat.
Oh, me can
I think, wait a second, because this one's mine.
But me want cookie.
Maybe this can be an exercise in delayed gratification. Like, so this...
Delayed gratification.
I know, it's a long
Big word.
It's a long word. It's probably too long for cookies.
It's too long. We just want to eat cookie.
The thing about this
we
is
want
that
to eat cookie now, though.
I know, I get that, but I really want to share it with you, but this one's mine. But I know that there'll be one for
So
you.
you're saying if me wait, me going to get cookie?
Ultimately, yes.
Okay, me going to wait.
Okay.
How long me have to wait?
Oh my God.
Oh,
Smell that?
me smelling it.
Smell.
No,
Smell.
me gonna look away from cookie.
Smell.
Me not going to look at cookie. Oh, this hard.
Okay.
This hard for Monster. Please, have pity on Monster. Please bring cookie. Me waited. Me did it. Me wait all day. Me just want to eat. Cookie. Nom 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 nom.
Doesn't it taste better for waiting?
Yeah, thank you for teaching me that.
That's all right. Do you want another one?
You have to ask. Nom 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 nom.
Sesame Street has chosen executive function and self-control to be the theme for the last year of programming. So you can watch all kinds of video of, Cookie Monster, delaying gratification, and learning strategies. They consulted with Walter Michel. They consulted with me and my colleagues, mostly my colleagues because I don't work with little kids. And in this little video, what basically Cookie Monster is learning is that resisting the chocolate chip cookie is really hard, but looking at the chocolate chip cookie and trying to resist it is even harder. So he learns the strategy of selective attention. See, there he goes, right? Not looking at it. Okay. So the last interesting strategy, before we get to the one that is not so great, is cognitive reappraisal, right? Thinking differently about your situation. Perhaps Shakespeare said it best, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. You can change mental representations. In the marshmallow task, when kids were encouraged to, if you want to, when you want to, you can think about the marshmallow like a fluffy white cloud. Miraculously, they're able to weigh twice or as long or longer. Right? Just because they thought about it in a different way. And the idea here is, can we think about, in particular, emotionally charged self-control situations in different ways? In a random assignment study I did with my collaborators at University of Michigan, we randomly assigned kids either to remember an angry memory in the first person, playing it through their own eyes, which they wrote about, or in the third person, observing their distant self, writing about it as if they were watching the whole thing happen through a YouTube video. And reappraising in that way, taking a third-person perspective, which, by the way, those of you who went to business school may recall from your negotiations class, is one of the things they often tell you in a charged negotiation, go to the balcony. In other words, watch the whole negotiation from a third-person perspective. You will regain your rational wits. And in this study, we found likewise that in the distance condition, where you think about things in the third person, you're able to regulate your anger towards the other person better. And in particular in that study, when we coded what kids wrote down, they made more thoughtful considerations about the situation and fewer just blame attributions of like, oh, it was their fault. Right? So it actually has been recently followed up in studies of new couples. When randomly assigned to have marital conflicts and write about them in the third person, they actually stay married longer than when they are encouraged to write about them, but through the first person lens. So that's all well and good, but I still think earlier, in general, is higher leverage than later. So if a kid is really struggling with self-control, I'd rather they change their physical situation or select a different situation, like go to the library instead of going home where the TV's on, than to wait all the way to the very end, which is simply, as the Buddhists would say, crush mind with mind. And it's really almost not a strategy at all, is it, right? Just do it. Like, I know it sells sneakers, but how helpful is it to just tell people, well, just do it. Just be more self-controlled. Or, Nancy Reagan, just don't do it, right? Just say no. Like, Neither of those things works all that well. I think we should equip kids with skills and strategies farther upstream than this, confrontation with temptation at hand. And then I will end here, which is to say that I think kids need to plan ahead, right? So a lot of our work actually focuses on planning. And without showing any more slides, I will just tell you that when kids can locate in the future what they would like to do with specificity, naming when and where they want to take what action, they are dramatically more likely to actually do something. And it goes for grown-ups too. So I will tell you that I recently did this exercise of planning ahead and actually saying, this is what I'm going to do, and this is when and where I'm going to do it, with my collaborator, Tamar Gendler, who's at Yale, and a high-functioning individual, I assure you. But even with Tamar, it was clear that, when it came down to how she was going to make progress on her new book, she hadn't actually specified what exactly she was going to do next, and when, and where she was going to do it. So we teach kids these little tricks, and I'll just show you some of the data, and then we'll go to question and answer, which is that at KIPP in New York, we were able, in a random assignment, placebo-controlled study, able to raise report card grades, teacher ratings of classroom conduct to teachers who are blind to condition, and school attendance over the subsequent semester. So I think there's real power here, in particular, because this is what teachers already do. They help kids make plans, they tell them to do their assignments, they encourage them to remember to space out the work. But this little twist, right, saying, okay, but we also have this scientific research, primarily done, by the way, at NYU by my collaborators, Gabrielle Ettingen and Peter Gollwitzer. So I want to give them the intellectual credit for this work. It's really theirs. This little tweak might actually dramatically improve upon what we're just doing in everyday practice. So it was a lot, I apologize, but that is everything I know about grit and self-control, and I'm happy to take your questions.
As schools and whole schools and teachers are starting to be more informed by the research, just what are the coolest things you see that people are doing differently as a result once they're informed of the research?
So I think the idea that has caught on more than any other really is growth mindset. So I like to say, and I think I'm right, that Carol Dweck is becoming more famous than Freud, at least in K through 12 education. I mean, I go to visit schools that I've never been to before, and I see these things on the wall, like kids writing essays about, how you can really grow, your ability to learn, et cetera, et cetera. So I think growth mindset's one thing. The second thing is, I think that we are starting a conversation here, and I know that's cliche, like starting a conversation is like building community. It sounds good, but it's also very cliche. But I get countless emails every day from fourth grade teachers in Indianapolis and principals in Australia and ministers in the United Kingdom, and I think it's a terrific pendulum swing back from standardized testing out the wazoo and focus on talent and should we advance you to this track versus that track, and I think a nice compensatory sort of swing back to, by the way, life is hard, it takes a lot of hard work, you're going to screw up a lot, you need other people, here's a conversation that moves in that direction, which I think is very healthy.
Cool. And then with the parent hat on, and you're a parent yourself, so what are the how do you synthesize all this? What are the biggest takeaways for as parents, what should we be starting to do and stop to do as a result of being informed by this work?
So the first thing I should tell parents is that there is a genetic component to everything that I said, right? So just in case you were wondering, and particular if you were like, so I've got these two kids and they couldn't be more different. Well, that is probably in large part because they don't have all the same genes, right? So siblings in the same family, on average, share 50% of the genes, but actually in terms of combinations of genes, and the new genetics work suggests that it's not just the genes you have, but the combinations that you have, the combination of cards in your deck that really matter. Well, that, siblings could really not necessarily have all the same combinations. And so when kids are really different, but they're raised under the same roof, eating the same breakfast cereal and given the same lectures, a lot of that is genetic. I've got two kids, they're 10 and 12, and one is a paragon of grit, and we're working on her self-control, And the other one is the exact opposite. So that's one reason I know these things aren't exactly the same. And I'll just say one thing that we do at home, maybe two things. Well, the first thing that I think is helpful is that we talk about psychology, and they're interested in it. Kids are interested in how the brain works, and and the marshmallow task and all that. So I actually think I've done the sort of intervention that we're doing with these videos and things with them sort of their whole lives. And it doesn't make it all completely easy, but I think it actually equips them with tools that maybe other kids don't have. Right? The second thing is we do have one thing in our family to increase grit, and that is the hard thing rule. So I read Amy Chua's book, Tiger Mom. I'm frequently confused with Amy Chua because, obviously, right? And, I study achievement. I have 2 girls, Asian, half white, So we are very similar. But the thing that I didn't really love about Amy Chua's book, there's this one phrase in there. She says, it's not enough to do what you love, period. Most people stink at what they love, right? And I got her point, I get it, right? You have to work hard, etc. But in our family, what I didn't want to do is say, you're playing piano and you're playing violin and I don't want to hear about it. I wanted them to actually discover their own interests and then learn how to work hard at them. So the hard thing rule is this. Everybody in our family has to be doing a hard thing at all times, right? Commitment, right? My job is really hard, I assure you, so I'm off, right? My husband is a real estate developer. He was like, have you heard about the financial crisis? I'm check, I am doing a really hard thing, right? And then my daughters, right? So the one daughter chose ballet. Actually, she chose ballet and of her own. She said, I also want to do piano. That's the gritty one. And she's been doing them consistently. And by the way, hard thing has a definition that it has to require deliberate practice, right? So the younger one, who's working on her grit, said, pottery. I was like, nah, that's not deliberate practice, right? You show up and you do this for a while. That's not deliberate. It's handcraft studio, no, okay. But she did, and she cycled through, I'll tell you, more than one hard thing. So she has done gymnastics, piano, ballet, track, and a few other things. But she never broke the rule because the rule is this. As long as you are engaged in something that you would say is a hard thing, that I would say is a hard thing, and as long as you only quit after the tuition payments are up, then you're meeting the rule. So she's not able to quit on bad days, right? So she's not able to come home and be like, well, I really wanted to have a play date with Ella, and I had to go to this practice, and I want to quit, right? Well, she's able to say that. She's just not able to quit. But the tuition payment comes up. It's a random Thursday afternoon. I say, hey, by the way, do you want to do gymnastics again or not? She's in a rational frame of mind. She has actually cycled through a lot of things, but she has recently. Not that recently, for a few years, been doing viola, and so that's her hard thing. So I like the hard thing rule. It doesn't have a scientific basis for it, but I think it gives you a little flexibility. It puts the responsibility on the kid to identify what it is, but it also imposes that structural discipline, which I think most kids need. They're not going to go out and be like, yeah, I'm going to do 45 minutes of deliberate practice and not cry and not want to, they do need that external, I think, reinforcement.
Thank you, Angela. When you're thinking about us, as a bunch of us here are teachers in school, elementary, middle, high school teachers, what do you think should be the key focus areas for teachers to teach grit and to teach self-control at the elementary, middle versus high school?
Yeah, so that's, the $60 million question, right? So what should we do? And, the short answer and the honest one is I really don't know yet. I've given you a sketch of some of these ideas. But let me also say this. I think teachers are already doing it, right? My guess is that here and there, behind that classroom door or another, you have teachers who are doing really terrific things, either very didactically and specifically, like teaching kids stuff, or just implicitly by modeling or activities, the way that they give kids feedback, what they say to a kid when they don't get a good grade, how they frame their feedback on an essay, that are actually promoting grit and self-control. What we need to do is to figure out, this is the problem with K-12 education, right? Innovation happens in these little pockets. Nobody knows about them. The ideas don't spread, and they're never systematically measured and then, disseminated. So, my guess is that they're already doing some things, and then beyond that, I'll just refer to these slides, which, is that's where our thinking is.
Angela, we have a couple questions here about context, and I think it's tied to how does optimism affect grit either from the standpoint of low-income children in low-income communities that they're coming from families, communities where there's things not to be optimistic about, or in any socioeconomic level, if they're just if they're struggling, a low-performing kid and just at the bottom of their class, what's the correlation there between optimism and grit?
Yeah, so, I've been asked this question. I've recently started working with Roland Fryer, who I will say, even though I'm being taped, he's a total trip. But Roland Fryer, you may know, is this very iconoclastic African-American professor of economics at Harvard. And he asked me this question about every 24 hours, actually, about, social class and grit and, and growth mindset and how all this fits together. And I say to him every 24 hours, like, I don't know still since yesterday when you asked me, but here's what we do know, right? There have been studies of delay of gratification across very different socioeconomic groups. And what's generally found, this is a research study by Gary Evans at Cornell, is that in general, there's a trend towards kids from more privileged, educated families delaying gratification more than kids from disadvantaged families. And recent work has highlighted that maybe what's going on here is trust. Maybe the kids who are not delaying gratification are actually being quite rational, in the sense that if you live in a world where, honestly, you don't know what's going to happen next, eat the marshmallow and get out of there. In one study that was published in the last couple of years, right before the experimenter says, here's how this is going to work, I'm going to leave the room, and you can, whatever, if you wait until I come back, you can. Right before that, they make a promise to the child and they break it, right? And you can get the delayed gratification times to go down close to zero when you've done that, and then you think about how that generalizes to kids' lives. If people are making promises to them and breaking them, if they live in uncertainty and chaos, well, what do you expect? I've done 4 longitudinal studies where I measured the number of negative life events that happen in school children's lives. This is particularly true in early adolescence, when sensitivity to life events is actually perhaps stronger than at other times in life. So early adolescence being around middle school, transition to high school, the number of negative life events at time 1 predicts your subjective experience of being stressed out, feeling lack of control, anxious, etc. At time 2. And that actually predicts decreases in self-control compared to baseline at time 3. So I think there is a story here that if you live in chaos, you will have a rational reaction to that, right? Which is to act impulsively and to think short-sightedly and to just say what you think, and and that is actually going to, in the long run, of course, hurt you. So there's a lot more to be said, and I guess I'll say this on grit. Nietzsche, before Kelly Clarkson, Nietzsche said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm not even sure that Kelly Clarkson knows that Nietzsche said that, but anyway, let's not quibble over details. Well, that's an interesting hypothesis, and I've actually had many teachers say to me, the kids who actually don't necessarily do well in the class, a lot of these kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, they are gritty, but they don't show it in conventional, ways, right? They're really gritty, taking care of their 4-year-old sister while their mother is on another bed, whatever it is, right? So whatever they're dealing with in their lives. And so that may be true. So Nietzsche may be right, actually, that the kids from adversity are getting stronger. But remember, Nietzsche also said, if it doesn't kill you. So the prescription certainly can't be more trauma, for kids. So anyway, all that to say is that we don't really know, and it's something that we're investigating. My intuition is that a little bit of adversity is necessary. There are kids on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and these include many of our kids, I would say, right? And their parents are reading every book, and is kale better than baby spinach? So those kids might in fact need a little more adversity, right? If we swoop in and solve every problem, if we get the best possible tutor for every subject, if we optimize everything in their life, well, it'll be like an arm in a cast, right? Which quickly atrophies because it's not needed, right, to be strong. So my guess is that, a lot of these kids are just under too much stress, and there might be a smaller number of kids who don't have enough of the right kinds.
Thank you. One last question. Today we tend to compliment kids very frequently, even when they're not that good. What is the effect of that?
So my daughter Lucy ran this race recently, and she comes back and she's got this pink ribbon and it says 8th place. I was like, weren't there only 8 people? She was like, yeah. I was like, it's like a New Yorker cartoon. I'm like, Roz Chaz doesn't even have to draw it. It's like, here, I'm holding. It's kind of so I do think that misplaced praise, right? Praise are just like, the kids plays anything, and you're like, oh, that was so great. Can be detrimental. Now, Carol Dweck would say that praise that emphasizes talent is itself, regardless of the level of performance, like that can be dangerous because particularly with perfectionistic kids, like, they'll get this growth mindset, fixed mindset about it, and they'll think, oh, it's all about talent, and so, well, separate from that, this kind of overpraise, right, praise for anything, there have been some research studies by a psychologist named Young Kim, who actually was a postdoc in our lab and now moved on back to Korea. But actually, interestingly, possibly for his Asian heritage, I think this may have influenced his worldview. He thinks that in America, the kids are just so overpraised that actually it sets them up for self-handicapping and sort of like weird psychological downstream things that are just not healthy, right? So if somebody's praising you and you're not that good, you might try to like fake it, or cover things because you've sort of never gotten adjusted to sort of telling you exactly the way it really is. And of course, they never get the information that deliberate practice says is really important. I mean, you never get the feedback like, no, that sentence is too long. You will never learn to write shorter sentences. Right? So I think we overpraise. Not everybody overpraises. But I think kids, if they know that you love them, right? I mean, I think a lot of schools like Yes and KIPP are tough love schools. If these kids know that you love them, you are in their corner, you are waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and staying up till 11 o'clock for them, they can handle it when you say, this essay is kind of a mess. I don't understand what you're saying here. It lacks structure there. I said develop 4 ideas. There are only 2. I'll meet you at 4 o'clock and we'll work on it, right? So I think that's I think the ideal. Not praise without any criticism, not criticism without any love, but both. So work hard, be nice, and thank you very much for your attention.